Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining in. This is Harshini Disiva Panditasekara, Program Manager of Biodiversity Sri Lanka. We'd like to welcome you all to this session on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the role of business, especially with regard to Sri Lankan businesses. Without further ado, since the session lead will actually introduce each of the participants and the speakers, I will hand over to Mr. Robert Iucn, Resident Representative of UNDP Sri Lanka, to start this session. Mr. Iucn.
Well, thank you. Good late afternoon to all of you online. Yes, my name is Robert Iucn. I'm the resident representative of UNDP in Sri Lanka, and I have a job here to do, which I will try to make as short and sweet as possible. And the main job is actually just to welcome you, the many distinguished conveners, presenters, participants from the world of government, business, civil society, and the UN, and beyond, to this policy dialogue on the Global Biodiversity Framework and the role of business in taking that forward, which has been organized by Biodiversity Sri Lanka in association with Dilmah Conservation and UNDP. And it's a real pleasure to kickstart the dialogue. It's nice to see so many participants from different walks of life joining this with different social and economic interests, I guess, that are circled around this virtual roundtable, coming together to discuss sustainability and biodiversity, timed to coincide with World Environment Day. And it's good to see familiar faces as well. So this, as I said, would be short and sweet, but let me just share a couple of rapid fire thoughts under the umbrella that I call COVID changes so much. The COVID-19 global pandemic has really shown us how human health is intimately connected with our relationship to the natural world. It's also enforced, unfortunately, an economic and social crisis, which has reminded us to think about the sustainability of the world's development and Sri Lanka's development. And in that realm, especially as we connect our thinking to business as a development driver, environment, our surrounding environment, plays a key and undeniable part. And it's worth noting that recovery from the COVID crisis, which is not just a health crisis, but a socioeconomic one, must also lead to countries uniting to preserve the natural world, its biodiversity, in line with the global commitments to achieve a better future for people and for our planet Earth. So in this spirit, I just wanted to encourage thinking and discussion which bridges areas of life, or what we call sometimes sectors, like environment, agriculture, food security, and human health. These are, I guess, targets for discussion anyway. Biodiversity is not a neutral word. It's loaded with meaning and values. I mean, it really is just telling us and implying that a more biodiverse planet is a healthier planet. And the targets reflect that in action. You know, and more than that, a healthy and biodiverse planet will lead to a better human condition. And we've seen this need has been quite evident over the past 70 or so days in Sri Lanka, where nature has had a chance to breathe, nature too. And so have we humans learned to see the world in a different way. And it should make us pause and think, how can we promote and sustain more of this so that we have healthy food systems, that we have sustainable production and consumption. So COVID changes all, and I think that can be also some food for thought for this session today. And the second thing to say about COVID changes all is that this is changing some things for the better. And I'm thinking about virtual Zoom discussions. You know, one lesson I've learned from some of these consultations is that the structures are sometimes flatter. The engagement is more efficient, more low cost. No flying protects skies and CO emissions, and no, you know, hotels also saves dollars and consumption. So there are pluses and minuses. So let's use this as a big plus. Now, one downside of this from me is that while I expect you will have very dynamic and productive discussions, I'll have to drop out of this Zoom call at one point because of another Zoom meeting with people spanning time zones reaching from the Pacific to the East Coast of the US in New York. So I'll be able to listen in on some of the deliberations, but not stay with you the whole time. Anyway, UNDP is proud to be part of this discussion and making the connection between different stakeholders in society who have an impact on the health of the planet Earth and its people. I wish you a good discussion. And with that, very briefly, I'm happy to hand over to Mr. Dilmah Fernando, Chairman of the Board of Directors, Biodiversity Sri Lanka, and Chief Executive Officer of Dilmah Ceylon Tea Company. Over to you, Dilmah.
Thank you, Robert. Enjoy your multiple Zooms and appreciate the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I cannot echo more strongly Robert's comments because people talk of a green recovery, and there can be no greater truth than that, because we can see when we look at economic, social aspects of our world that there is clearly a strong green dimension. And with that, I would like to introduce Biodiversity Sri Lanka. We are a national platform entirely owned and driven by the private sector, established to build engagement across the corporate sector, across the state and academia. We are focusing on biodiversity and environmental conservation in Sri Lanka, and our initiating partners comprise Iucn, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and Dilmah Conservation. Now, today, in discussing post-2020 global biodiversity frameworks and the role of business, one very critical point is the aspiration of a 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Now, this is something that will be adopted as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, as part of the 2020 Convention on Biological Diversity. And what it does is it recognizes the value that biodiversity provides to people and economic growth. Of course, for us, we have an enduring connection in the tea business with nature, so for us it is very evident. But what is even more evident through this COVID experience is the fact that whether it comprises the air we breathe, the water that we require for business and for ourselves, there is a critical role that ecosystem services play in terms of delivering commercial value, or in fact adding value to any aspect of business. And so that comes together in the urgent need for international efforts to halt the loss of biodiversity, and the recognition that it is only through collaboration, the combined influence of all sectors, that we can conserve and ensure that as businesses, as governments, we sustainably use the different components of biodiversity. So recognizing that business has an important role to play in developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, providing leadership, sharing good practice, and of course, communication. We especially welcome the participants in this discussion, and I think that it would be best at this point to go straight into the discussion, which starts with Dr. Markus Lehmann. Markus Lehmann is Senior Program Management Officer, UN Environment, and Head of the Economic Policy Unit at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. He'll talk about how global partnership for business and biodiversity, how it's moving ahead in the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and the role that national and regional platforms such as Biodiversity Sri Lanka and others like us can play in this process. So welcome, Dr. Lehmann. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to provide you, as you mentioned, an overview on where we stand on the process in developing the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the role of businesses in there. I had a couple of slides to share. If Hashini, if you could kindly perhaps enable the screen sharing mode, then I could bring those up on the screen. Would that be possible?
Yes, UNDP, can we please have Dr. Lehmann's screen sharing made possible?
Yes, I should be able to share my screen now.
Okay, excellent. Here you go. Yeah, very good. So yeah, perhaps just to as a background for those that are not that familiar with the convention, a quick overview. Of course, we have now quite an age with over 25 years into existence. The main objectives of the convention: conservation, sustainable use, but also going beyond the traditional nature conservation agenda, the importance of access to genetic resources and equitable sharing of their benefits. We now have, for the current decade, as you know, the strategic plan for biodiversity with its Iucn biodiversity targets. They will expire in 2020, obviously, but of course there is strong interest in keeping the spirit, if not the wording of the targets over into the next decade. So this is what we are working on. And finally, also to mention the two protocols that we have on biosafety, the Cartagena Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. So perhaps just as a quick overview where we stand in developing the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We had basically first steps collecting views from parties from a various range of stakeholders, including businesses. We had several contributions, written submissions from business organizations, including, by the way, from the Global Partnership on Business and Biodiversity under the then leadership of George Bos. So that was very welcome. Based on that, the co-chairs developed a zero draft on which was considered last January in Rome at the second meeting of the dedicated working group. We now basically have a further series of online consultation to webinars, etc., etc. The upcoming intersessional meetings of Substar 24 will consider specifically indicators for the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as a couple of dedicated closely related processes such as on resource mobilization or on mainstreaming. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, we will have the third meeting, which basically will bring the different threads together based on a first draft of the co-chairs, based on the zero draft considered in Rome. And then after subsequent negotiations by parties, that will be finalized in COP15. I should mention here already that as part of COP15, we always have our biannual Global Business and Biodiversity Forum, which in fact provides one of the main or an important opportunity for the business sector to engage with parties and the other stakeholders at COP. Just to flag the series of other key events, we just already had a couple of weeks ago online an OECD Biofin meeting specifically on resource mobilization and finance for the next decade. We will have in September the Biodiversity Summit of the United Nations General Assembly, which is currently under preparation. And then, of course, seeing that we also have Gerard Bos on board here, to flag the importance of the IUCN World Conservation Congress and the opportunities for businesses to being provided there. So, on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as it's currently taking shape, we have the Vision 2050, which is actually coming already from the last strategic plan, where basically we try to achieve living in harmony with nature by 2015. I'm not going to read it out for lack of time, but this is basically what it says. It is very likely to stay that way. What is more like already still under development is, of course, the goals, the targets, the indicators, etc. I reflected here in this little overview graph the current structure as proposed by the co-chairs in their zero draft. So the important thing is for business engagement, under the goals and targets, we have a few of them which really provide the main entry points for business engagement and for businesses basically to become active in the implementation of Post-2020. And those relate basically what we call to the mainstream of biodiversity, in particular into key economic sectors like agriculture, like forestry, like fisheries, but also sectors like infrastructure, manufacturing and processing, etc. So closely related to the post-2020 target, we are also currently developing a long-term approach for mainstreaming that's being undertaken with the help of an advisory group, which includes experts from various sectors and a strong representation from businesses. We have basically 3 strategy areas identified in this long-term approach that is basically mainly organized along key actors, and of the key actors is indeed businesses and including the financial sector. So this is the second strategy area where we do define a couple of specific goals, targets, associated policies, actions to be taken in an action plan, etc. So this provides an important entry point, and it will be reflected in the post-2020 global biodiversity frameworks in the targets there. Yeah, as I said, I mean, businesses and of course financial sector businesses play a fundamental role in the implementation of the post-2020. And it's basically along 3 axes or major dimensions, if you may. It's about the integration of biodiversity assessments and risk managements into business processes, operations, but also business models. It is about greening the supply chains and in the context of finance businesses, greening portfolios across the board. Specifically for financial sector businesses, it is also about increasing funding for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And it is last but not least also reporting on their impacts and also on their dependencies, because many businesses actually depend on ecosystem services, as has been observed earlier. So, and this provides basically the hooks or the entry points for the work on mainstreaming biodiversity, and then of course for the work on resource mobilization. So let's perhaps, before I close, say one word in our business engagement program. We work with national and regional initiatives through the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity, where we do have 21 national and regional established initiatives, including, of course, the very active national partnership here in Sri Lanka. The Global Partnership provides a platform for information sharing on best practices, on tools, mechanisms, business metrics for biodiversity, etc. It also provides a broader network for liaising with the complete ecosystem of business associations, initiatives, etc., but also going beyond businesses, liaising with NGOs and governments to promote sustainable practices for businesses. So we do, on a regular basis, participate or organize regional workshops through webinars these days, of course, development of communication materials and events. As I mentioned, there was already an opportunity for businesses to provide inputs through the consultation process for the Post-2020 framework through online submissions. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the dedicated process on mainstreaming, which also provided such opportunities. As we move now closer to the negotiation phase in the formal negotiations of the open-ended working group, of course, business association will be able and will participate as observers and can thus make their views heard and shared with the parties. We do have an emerging what we call action agenda, which is basically an online platform for catalyzing commitments from non-state actors with a view to promote the implementation of the Post-2020 framework. That includes a window for businesses. It is, you have a preliminary version online already. It is under further development, so you can stay tuned for further news on that front. Yeah, final slide, just to mention a bit more information on the global partnership. We have currently, as I said, 21 members. But of course, we have basically active streams into more than 60 countries and thousands of businesses worldwide. This is basically the broader network, what it provides us as through the global partnership. So opportunities at COP15 and beyond. I mentioned the Business and Biodiversity Forum. That will be a 2-day event during the COP. Providing a platform to keynote speakers. We will have panels and parallel sessions, bringing together business and financial sector representatives, governments and NGOs. And we will most likely organize it in close connection with the high level, the ministerial section of the COP15. So businesses will have an opportunity to provide a political message to the ministers at COP. And then that can hopefully garner further momentum for post-2020. We will have an Innovation and Technology Expo linked to the Global Business and Biodiversity Forum, providing a specific platform for technology innovation and solutions from a business perspective. And last but not least, we hope that the action agenda will take shape by then, so that we can showcase commitments and action from businesses, but also from other key stakeholders for the implementation of the next stage, for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework in the next decade. This is basically where we stand. Yeah, the process is in full swing, and stay tuned as we move to the next phases. The next major stepping stone is, of course, the intersessional meetings of the technical body and the body on implementation. The dates are, given the circumstances with the health crisis, the pandemic, not yet clear, but will most likely take place physically, if that is that will be possible in probably around October this year. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the further contributions.
Thank you, Dr. Lehmann. And I think that technology part is particularly important because, as we have seen in the past few months, it is probably in that respect that business can most complement the scientific and state and international objectives in relation to biodiversity and so on. A couple of reminders before we move on to Mr. Gerard Bos. If you have any questions, please send them to the audience. Please send them strictly through the chat. You can use the Zoom chat, and I would also like to welcome Mrs. Padma Bekon, who has joined us. She's Director of Biodiversity from the Ministry of Environment and Wildlife Resources. Welcome, welcome, Padma.
Good afternoon, Dilmah, and all
Good
of
afternoon.
you. Good afternoon.
Welcome. So your audio is working all right now?
Yeah. So, okay.
Excellent. So we will continue with the program, and I will invite you back in a short moment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. So may I now request Director of Business and Biodiversity at IUCN, Mr. Gerard Bos, who's going to talk to us about appropriate, applicable, and implementable targets as part of the framework for business. Mr. Gerard Bos.
Thank you very much, Dylan, and good afternoon to all of you. So it's my pleasure to be with you here and with such a distinguished panel. So I will make 4 points in my intervention and try to keep it short so that we allow for the other speakers and also for some discussion at the end of the all these presentations. First point, we must learn from the past, but also the more recent crisis, as was alluded by the previous speakers, and build more synergies with other multilateral agreements. I'll come back to that. Second, IUCN very much welcomes the holistic and the comprehensive nature of the Zero Draft for the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, but it needs to speak to business if we want them to act upon it. Third, the biodiversity mainstream is key. It was highlighted by Markus before. And we see nature-based solution as a key entry point to meet people's needs, address societal challenges, and therefore provide a tangible role for economic actors. And finally, let's learn also from the post-COVID and look at the recovery packages and need to make sure that these are socially and environmentally sound. So we must heed the lessons from the past. So under the current strategic plan of the biodiversity strategy, most of the targets have unfortunately not been met. But let's be very clear, biodiversity would have suffered much worse without all the efforts that have been carried out by many of you. The main shortfall is perhaps one of implementation and getting all the actors on board. And one could argue that we probably did not include the private sector early enough in this process. But Markus highlighted to you what we're doing to make sure that business is included more quickly. And also the Sri Lanka Business and Biodiversity Platform is showing your engagement, such as the Global Business and Biodiversity Platform. Now, for example, in the Paris Agreement, all the contributions from all society and also we're all explicitly not only at the country level, but also non-state actors were put together to determine where they can contribute to the overall goals. That will be an exciting challenge for the biodiversity one as well. Now, as the CBD regional consultation noted last year, there's a need to consider how future biodiversity targets will relate to or complement the Sustainable Development Goals. So overall, IUCN clearly welcomes the Zero Draft for the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. We support it, especially its 5 outcome goals that are addressing ecosystems, species, genetic diversity, I would say the raw material of biodiversity, but this needs to be underlined and underpinned by sustainable use and access and benefit sharing of the natural resources. Now, the Zero Draft already includes 2 draft targets that relate to nature-based solutions. One in the context of clean water, the other one on climate change and adaptation. Now, IUCN has proposed that this is expanded to cover more of the societal challenges, such as food security, disaster risk reduction, and building the new infrastructure alongside the provision of clean water and climate change. Now, next month, and at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in January 2021, IUCN will unveil a global standard on nature-based solutions, which will provide further guidance to both the public and the private sector on how they can consistently and reliably design, verify, and scale up these solutions. On the Zero Draft, the timing and the ambition, we need really to maximize the political ambition that there is out there at the moment, but ensure that it's ecologically feasible. Our scientists argue that we need to set timelines for halting the overall loss by 2020, 2030. And others are actually saying it should be happening much earlier. Also, as restoration takes decades, we need to set a timeline for the overall gain by 2050, consistent with the 2050 vision, the SDGs, but also look at what is coming out of the UN decade of restoration. So on the proposed actions target that CBI 20s, IUCN considered that the proposed targets in the zero draft are also very strong. However, I'm coming back to my first point. The more appropriate, applicable, and implementable these targets are for business to use, the greater the uptake and the contribution we can expect to see. So this is why I'm looking also at the business speakers later on this call to provide their views and insights, because we want to facilitate this uptake. And for that, we probably need somehow to simplify and adapt the language that we use traditionally in the conservation community and adapt it to the business audience. Now, finally, on the biodiversity mainstream, to help accelerate this effort, which was mentioned previously, we are working on the non-state actor as well as state actor commitments. And IUCN is collaborating with WWF France and Expertise France in what is called the Biodiversity Dev 2030 initiative, where we're providing 16 pilot countries with technical support so that they can accelerate the biodiversity mainstream into key economic actors that are relevant in their specific context. And the idea is to catalyze sector-based commitments emerging from a shared scientific assessment of threats and a multi-stakeholder dialogue. And we hope to be presenting this at COP15, but also final outcomes in 2021. So in conclusion, by demonstrating that nature does provide multiple goods and services to help address societal challenges, you're hearing the IUCN nature-based solutions concept behind these words. IUCN hopes that economic actors will recognize, embrace, and value nature as it underpins the goods and the services provided by nature. Nature should be fully integrated in the design of business models and products and services, and some of you are already doing that, which will result in business gains as well as produce many co-benefits. And we truly hope that this will also be considered when post-COVID recovery packages are being considered at the moment and hopefully being implemented. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gerard. That is greatly appreciated. And now I would like to invite Ms. Padma Abekon, who's going to share a Sri Lankan perspective with us. She is the Director of the Biodiversity Secretariat. And Padma, if you're ready, may I invite you to talk a little bit about the Sri Lankan context in implementing and identifying the baseline requirement of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how these should be reflected in the framework. Thank you and welcome, Padma.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, good afternoon for all of the upper panel and distinguished delegates. As you all are aware, Sri Lanka is very rich biodiversity and very unique endemism also there. Therefore, we need to, as the objective of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have to conserve our biodiversity and we have to sustainably use, and we need access to genetic resources and benefit sharing. To fulfill those requirements, we have several policies, tools, and other mechanisms. Mainly, biodiversity conservation will have done through the national policy on environmental conservation, environmental policy. Other than that, we have forest policy, we have wildlife policy, and several policies we have not only the mainly conservation purposes, other purposes also, the fisheries and aquatic resources, their policy, then they have some provisions for the conservation, not only the production and other purposes. Other than that, we have different type of legal frameworks, mainly forest ordinance, then fauna and flora protection ordinance. Also, we use for the conservation of our national biodiversity. Main tool is the conservation of biodiversity is National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan. National Biodiversity, first National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan prepared in 1998. Then second one is 2016 to 2022. It is prepared based on the Aichi targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now we are in later part of the national Aichi targets, but our National Biodiversity Strategic Plan will go up to 2022. Therefore, we can use our National Strategic Plan as for the Post-2020 framework as well. In a Post-2020 framework, as earlier mentioned, zero draft is prepared, and now first Rome, in the Rome discussion, CBD prepared the first draft. We have studied this framework for the Post-2020 framework. We have to establish a vision and the mission and the other activities related to the Post-2020 framework. In relation to preparation of the Post-2020 framework, now we plan to hold some discussions with the all relevant stakeholders in relation to the zero draft, but because of the past pandemic reason, we was unable to hold those discussions, but we plan several discussions to based on the zero draft. But now we have the first draft, therefore we can go through those these recommendations. Now CBD released the recommendations of the Post-2020 framework. We can use this framework to initiate the discussion on preparation of the Sri Lanka contest. Now, in that sense, we plan to discuss with the all relevant stakeholders, including private sector, community organizations, and the either international, intergovernmental organization like Iucn. Now we plan and we are working on that at the moment. In future, before the COP15, we plan to hold all discussions with the all relevant stakeholders and prepare the Sri Lankan plan related to the first draft and the recommendation. Now we are working on that in Post-2020 framework. And in relation to strengthening the MBSAP implementation, because our MBSAP is not completed in this year. We have another 2 years. Therefore, we have to do some activities to strengthen the implementation of MBSAP, because a lot of activities we have identified as a technical activities. Some we need some taxonomic information and some habitat restoration, like some strategic planning. Therefore, we need different mechanisms to strengthen implementation of the achieve the in our MBSAP. We have 12 targets we need to achieve. Those targets with the 87 activities are there. Those activities relevant to several stakeholders like private sector, community, and government, non-government, like several stakeholders participation are needed. Therefore, we think about that how we can strengthen the implementation of the MBSAP. We need to mainly we need technical know-how and capacity building for all stakeholders to strengthen implementation, because sometimes, as the example, sometimes we need conserve some taxa, lesser known taxa, small creatures, but people cannot identify the species. Then we have to aware them. Like that, we need to do some awareness. Then we need to do some planning, integrated planning process with the all relevant stakeholders. Like this, we need several activities we have to do. And other than we need to establish a data sharing mechanism as well. So, now we are working on that. Then we can implement successfully our MBSAP. And we in our MBSAP, we have identified the stakeholders for different activities, but sometimes they don't have clear identification of their roles. Therefore, we need to train them what is their roles and what can do them, and like this we have to do to strengthen the MBSAP, because we need to achieve our MBSAP targets within 2022. Therefore, we need then we can include some post-2020 targets to the our existing national plan. Those are the plans we will do in future related to the biodiversity conservation and the related to post-2020 framework preparation and the MBSAP strengthening, MBSAP implementation strengthening as a policy institution. It's a government institution and the policy implementation institution. We have to do those things with relevant all stakeholders. I seek all stakeholders' participation and their contribution to do those activities to conserve our biodiversity and sustainably use our biodiversity. Not only the conservation, we need to sustainable use as well. Therefore, we are now, up to now, we didn't sign the Nagoya Protocol, but we are preparing policy on related to Nagoya Protocol, access to access to the genetic resources and benefit sharing. Then we can go ahead with that policies and other tools, preparation of the material transfer agreement, like that we can go ahead with those things. Therefore, I seek your fullest cooperation and contribution to conserve our biodiversity, and as the biodiversity SL already committed for that, and I appreciate their contribution for the conservation of biodiversity. As a government institution, I will conclude my presentation that. Thank you for inviting me for this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padma. Your passionate request and explanation are deeply appreciated. And so, in line with the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, society clearly needs a roadmap. We need cross-sectoral collaboration, integration with the role, integrating the role of the SDGs within the proposed framework, and so on. So, to add to the comments that Padma and other speakers have shared, I would like to invite Ramita Wijetunga, National Program Officer from UNDP Sri Lanka, to share some comments. Ramita, I think you're muted. We can't hear your audio.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Dilhan, for the opportunity. And I'd like to thank Biodiversity Sri Lanka for this opportunity given to UNDP to express our views. Yes, actually, I would like to share some of the thoughts, because very recently we had a discussion amongst a few of our friends on how biodiversity can be integrated or mainstreamed into all the SDGs, and one person asked me how biodiversity is important for the construction industry, because construction is one of the key areas, and I was able to find out a couple of interesting examples, like most of the ancient stupas or dagabas were constructed with some mortar that is being used, that is being produced with some biodiversity aspect. And even now we know that we are using grasses to manage the temperature inside the building. So likewise, I mean, it is only a matter of innovative thinking, innovative use of our knowledge and experiences is required to understand the biodiversity impacts to all of our life. Actually, this brings to another important thing, because that shows, I mean, in whichever the way, because if you go through the SDGs, I mean, wherever you see, look into, you can see the impact, I mean, the inputs of biodiversity and the importance of it. So that means we need only the commitment and innovative thinking and drive to achieve results of the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. Of course, as mentioned by Iucn representative, that I mean, we were not very happy with the performance from 2011 to 2020 period. Probably our Aichi targets have not been met, but still, I think we should be happy about what we have done and the approaches we have identified, especially the working with business sector, especially the working with private sector, and giving them the due recognition in their contributions, in their part to be played in biodiversity conservation is very important thing. So I think we should not only look at the large initiatives, but small initiatives, small steps as well, because sometimes the small steps might matter a lot and might trigger a big revolution in the process. So actually I can remember when I was part of the team to promote traditional rice varieties in Sri Lanka early 2000. I mean, basically, it was not possible to do that, and not many people have even heard of those things. So, but at least if you compare this current situation after 20 years, now we know at least 10, 15 varieties are available in even any supermarket. So, but the issue was that things are not possible with the existing marketing system and value chain. So we had to couple this with some other value offering. So what we thought was that it was better to link it with health consciousness of the people. Likewise, probably the biodiversity sector, biodiversity enthusiasts, biodiversity experts, biodiversity related professionals may have to link with other sectors to promote the cause of biodiversity, especially in this post-COVID scenario, because as we all know that the economy is not doing well, and the biodiversity might not be the top priority for many decision makers. So basically we may have to come up with innovative mechanisms and strategies to implement our post-2020 biodiversity framework as well, because finances and other resources also matter to get things done and get things done on time. In that sense, it is not only the finance, but the expertise as well. So we know that we should look for expertise from all the sectors, and especially the private sector. The business sector can play a huge part in getting things done and getting the urgency injected into these processes, because we can't just wait for 2050 or 2030, or I mean, as soon as possible we have to achieve, and that urgency requires the private sector involvement a lot. Actually, since time is very restricted, because I have already passed my allocated 5 minutes time, so I must emphasize that there is a role for everybody, and we should, develop partnerships to achieve post-2020 biodiversity targets as well. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dilmah.
Thank you, Ramita. Appreciate your comments. Absolutely spot on. It's about collaboration, and that's how we're going to achieve the outcome. So, again, in the interest of time, we'll move straight on to the business dialogue, and I would like to invite Roshan Rajadure, who's the managing director of Haley's Plantations. Roshan is representing the agribusiness and plantation sector. So, Roshan, please remember to unmute yourself, and looking forward to hearing your comments.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Dilmah mentioned, I represent a very vital agri-sector, that's the plantation sector of our country, where we provide sustainable livelihood for about 10% of our population, particularly where the large plantations play host to about 1 million resident population. Now we operate in the upcountry mainly, where the vast majority of our country's riverine sources have their catchments. And not only do we perform industrial function, but we have a national function in protecting our water sources. So the upcountry has the most varied, most richest, most diversified, and the most amount of hotspots. So plantation sector, therefore, has been operating in this ecosystem for over 150 years. And we can say that's a place where river, lake, mountain, and plain meet, and where man, flora, and fauna integrate in an intrinsic and a wholly sustainable method. So I'm going to be very brief because of the time constraint I have, and I want to confirm or give the assurance and show our demonstration, the plantation sector's willingness to commit ourselves to maintaining and sustaining this biosystem and conserve the ecological balance in our area that we operate. Well, how we do is by, we very briefly, we have identified all the existing ecosystems and we take steps to protect and where possible restore them to their original condition and through conservation and rehabilitation processes. Then we also have integrated good agricultural practices into our operations, particularly conservation and management operations. And as we are aware, we have signatories or we conform to some of the world's most demanding certifications like Rainforest Alliance, the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Certifications, Iucn, and we are active members of the Sri Lanka Biodiversity Forum. So in addition to that, we also facilitate creating awareness by research and education and participatory exercises with academic bodies. And we also have a very big role in inventorizing all fauna and flora in our estates. And we identify hotspots and we create an awareness amongst our population who are resident. So we are having a challenging situation because we deal with a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and not so homogeneous population living in our plantation areas. And because of the nature of our job and nature of our operations, we face a fair amount of challenges in making the sensitivity to biodiversity and ecosystem awareness spread amongst the vast population under our care. So overall, I would give an assurance that the plantation sector has and will demonstrate and give our 100% commitment and support to fostering, protecting, and enhancing the biodiversity of our area where we operate, particularly from the sea level up to the highest level in Sri Lanka, up to 7,000 feet. So we have done many things like in terms of ecosystem conservation, biodiversity conservation. Particularly water is an important element in our biodiversity conservation systems. We have taken many steps to conserve water, to retain the purity and the sustainable flow of water downstream, because as I mentioned earlier, we play host to a lot of catchment areas where many riverine systems originate from the upcountry. So I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of questions because particularly we have undertaken very specific targeted activities like planting over 1 million trees in the upcountry, in the hillsides, and St. Clair's waterfall is a special project that the plantation sector has undertaken to protect the environment of that very pristine and very susceptible water flow area. So likewise, the plantation sector has undertaken many initiatives which time doesn't permit me, and I'm open for question during the discussion time to give you more information as necessary and required. Thank you very much. I await questions during the Q&A time. Thank you, Dilmah.
Thank you very much, Roshan. St. Clair, it will be fantastic to see the waterfall flowing again. So thank you for that project. So now I would like to invite Mr. Nalaka Amartunga, who is CEO of Walkers Tours, and he represents, Nalaka represents the travel and tourism sector. Nalaka.
Thanks, Dylan. Thank you very much. And Biodiversity Sri Lanka team, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start first and foremost. I need to mention that I'm no expert when it comes to biodiversity, but I know for a fact that there are a lot of teams, a lot of focus groups who's doing a lot of research. A lot of research papers have been put forth for implementation. And but I would want to touch mostly on a practical sense and what we see on a day-to-day basis when it comes to tourism, especially the tourism sector. So if you look at it, tourism in Sri Lanka has two segments. You have the hotel segment as well as the inbound travel segment, which consists, those are the two main bodies, I would say. Hotels, I think there's a proper mechanism in place, especially when it comes to a new development. There are a lot of controls in place, so that to ensure that it is done in a proper manner, and the controls also relates to conserving biodiversity. But when you look at the other element, the inbound travel business, that is where I feel that the controls are not in place to that extent, where what you need today is just the SLTDA or the Sri Lanka Tourist Board license to operate a travel agency. And just by having that license, that allows you to do anything with regard to any part of it. It covers the whole spectrum. It could be just a wildlife tour, it could be a cultural tour, any tour. They are eligible to operate within Sri Lanka just by one license, which I personally feel that if you are looking at going into more detail, and if you are looking at safeguarding the natural resources, where our industry or the tourism industry has a direct impact, we need to be more mindful as to whether the stakeholders or the tourism sector who's running those businesses, whether they have that basic knowledge, which I see that maybe to that extent, maybe they don't have it. And I will come to that in my slide. But before I go, if you can maybe put the first slide up, the UNDP team, if you can just put, yeah. So the first slide, I just want to explain as the private sector, as Roshan also explained, at John Keel's, I think we have a foundation unit which is dedicated for biodiversity for sustainability. So if you look at most of the projects, these are few of the projects which are ongoing, which started off some time back, but these are ongoing. And if you look at projects like the Project Leopard, the elephant conservation project, which we started off, if you look at the plastic cycle project that we kicked off about 2 years ago, those all have added a lot of value, and it has been spoken of and even taken for certain what you call research papers. So I think as a private sector, yes, we are doing that. These are few things that, yeah, we can take off the slide. These are few things that we do at John Keel's. But if you look at all the other establishments, the responsible formal establishments, if you look at it in their own right, they have contributed very well, even like what Ms. Padma also explained. Yes, the private sector is with you. They will do their bit. But when it comes to tourism, we cannot forget there is also an informal sector, which is equally big, and it is growing. Of course, post-COVID, there will be some sort of a, I would say, it will slow down a bit. But of course, when things pick up, maybe in 1 year or maybe 1.5 years down the line, we need to keep a tab on the informal sector. Just to give you some statistics, I would just maybe not dwell on it much. But from 2009, when the actual tourism started post-war, we only had about 400,000 or 500,000 tourists coming into the country, but it grew up to about 2.3 million in 2018-19. So that's about almost a 500% increase. But if you look at the framework that that is governed by, or the tourism and the legal framework or the controls what we have, whether that got updated to that extent is a question that we have. Yes, ad hoc controls was brought in, especially on biodiversity and controlling and ensuring that we do the way we do things in a responsible manner. But it has not been updated to cater to the growth that we saw. I think that is where we see a mismatch when it comes to our sector. And also, when you look at, if you look at the operators or the companies, but when they operate certain tours and when they do certain excursions, the resources they use. For example, I'll take Yala for an example. Yala is where you have the highest density of leopards, but if you really look at a jeep driver or maybe a person who does the excursion per se, they are not really educated or they are not really certified per se. But if you look at other countries like Africa or India for that matter, you have those elements coming in. So this sort of gives a negative vibe to the whole experience, as well as it also does not help the cause that what we are all trying to do is on saving our biodiversity and saving our wildlife, especially the Yala, where we have to sort of, we have to ensure that we do things to safeguard for our future generations. So these are few things that I see that we need to quickly address. And also, interest of time, I would take on questions later on, but I want to show you one slide which I've specifically put. Can you just put the second slide if you don't mind, the UNDP team? Yeah, I just want you all to, just take a minute off and just, look at this. And as you all know, we had the black leopard, which we thought is extinct. And we had a replica built in one of the museums in Sri Lanka. But about 3 or 4 months ago, we found out that the black leopard is still living. This flyer came up just 3 days or 4 days after we found out that the black leopard is living. So the question is, if I ask a question, do you think there's anything wrong in this, or do you think that there's something wrong? Your gut might say that there is something wrong in this flyer because the black leopard was found, but now it's on a flyer, right? The flyer doesn't talk about really a black leopard being marketed, but of course, the black leopard being there is sort of, in an indirect manner, we're saying that, okay, come and see the black leopard with us. I don't find fault with this particular company, which I have not mentioned names, but my fact is that if somebody is putting a flyer without that fear factor and without even thinking twice of, whether what I'm doing is responsible or not, I think that is where I think as we have, as a country, as a sector, we have lost the plot. So if you don't have that, the framework, companies will do what they want. I think that is where we have not really gained mileage, or not really put our processes together, so that people will know what are the do's and the don'ts. So if we have a framework in place, it will be very much easy, and it will be a task that even for monitoring purposes, you can actually see who are the people who are doing it right and who are the people who need some sort of a training or whatnot. So that there will be some sort of a yardstick to measure. So just to sort of maybe summarize my presentation and the key areas that I would want to suggest the government as well as the teams involved, is that we need to come up with an operational framework, which is very important for the sector, not only for the tourism sector. I think for any sector for that matter there should be a very, very strong sort of a framework that all of us can relate to, and so that we know what is our boundary and what are the do's and the don'ts. And also the divisions, I think most of the divisions are now working in unison, but I think a cohesive approach is very much needed. If you look at, I think, the conservation teams to, if you look at the Department of Wildlife Conservation, to the Sri Lanka Tourism, to the Ministry of Tourism, to all these are sometimes working in silos. It has improved a lot, but I would say that if you are looking at tourism for the future, we have to look at how we can work in unison for the betterment of tourism, as well as for the betterment of safeguarding the wildlife and the biodiversity, which is a direct impact. And also, I've been talking in many forums, is the usage of digital, because I think that is where a lot of, I think there was a couple of blueprints done some time back. If you have a platform that makes it even easier to manage the over-visitation, capacity planning, and whatnot. So I think these are not rocket science. This can be done if we really plan it out. But I feel that the structures that has been in place for a long time, it has become like what we have seen. The biggest issue has been sort of breaking those structures and restructuring it to cater to the new normal, or maybe the future that we all aspire. But the question is, it has not been successful to that extent. But if we are to do it right, I think there have been so much of research done. I don't think we have to reinvent that wheel. There are so many research papers which can help us. But how we execute it and put it into an action plan would be the next step that we should all be concentrating. So thank you, and I'm available for any questions later on at the latter part of the presentation. Thank you. Thanks, Dilmah.
Thank you very much, Nalaka. And it's good to see that the tourism industry in Sri Lanka has come together as an alliance, and they are addressing many of these questions. So you can be sure, Nalaka, that we as Biodiversity Sri Lanka will be engaging with you, and together with UNDP, we will be sharing some information on those frameworks. So thank you very much for that. And with having looked at plantations and travel and tourism, we would like to now move on to banking and finance, and representing that sector is Aroshi Ranatunga. She's Head of Sustainability at Citizens Development Business Finance PLC. Aroshi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks Dilhan. Good evening everyone. The climate emergency and biodiversity crisis is inextricably linked and must be addressed in tandem. So today we are talking about post-2020, and I would also like to say that this is post-COVID 2020 that we are talking about. So why we see a climate emergency today is nothing but the human intervention and consumption of fossil fuels causing the rise in GHG emissions, extreme weather conditions, loss of biodiversity, and it is hindering sustainable economic growth, which has then led to a health emergency with new disease outbreaks, and now it shows the repercussions towards an economic emergency. So as per the Asian Development Bank state that Sri Lanka may face 1.2% loss of annual GDP by 2050 if measures are not taken to address the climate change and biodiversity losses. Despite Sri Lanka being a biodiversity hotspot, UNDP Biofin initiative also estimates that Sri Lanka will be needed 30 billion rupees worth investment within next 5 years to achieve national biodiversity targets. So this is why it is essential to have a green recovery plan leading towards a green economy coupled with sustainable financing to mitigate against and adapt to climate change and biodiversity crisis, leveraging sustainable finance for biodiversity conservation in Sri Lanka. So there are several initiatives that in Sri Lanka also they have been taken up, such as Sri Lanka Sustainable Banking Initiatives has come up with 11 sustainable banking principles aiming to integrate ENS consideration into the operations. The Biofin initiative determines the funding requirement for biodiversity conservation. The Colombo Stock Exchange joined the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange and launched Communicating Sustainability, providing guidance on sustainable reporting. And in parallel, as financial regulators, Central Bank of Sri Lanka has announced the roadmap focusing on sustainable finance practices to help financial institutions effectively manage their ESG risk and promoting sustainable finance in Sri Lanka. So despite of all these positive initiatives, positive signs in the financial services sector, let me also bring out a few challenges, as I feel this platform with technical experts who can support us to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets by the climate change mitigation strategy as well. So for that, we need a robust sustainable finance framework to promote green lending to finance biodiversity plans. And also we need to relook at our business models and reconsider on our portfolio considerations towards responsible and green financing, rather following the same route of how we conduct our business before. Some of the challenges I would say, now there is an interesting aspect of the green bonds are coming in, which are popular source in Europe, whose proceeds are used to fund environmentally friendly projects. Even though they are relatively new segment of the bond market, there is a huge demand with investors. Some of the green bond projects are those related to clean water, clean energy, clean mobility, energy efficiency, habitat restoration. So, but the challenge is that whether there are common metrics and frameworks to quantify and understand and measure the biodiversity impacts and their dependencies. Another fact is that mobilizing new investors and creating avenues for easy access of sustainability financing, which is also vital to address. Having a clear direction and policies to get along with green climate funding lines, paving the way for easy climate, resilient and direct access to financial institutions with the intermediation by the government sector is something that I would also specifically like to highlight at this point. Because it's true that some of the commercial banks, they have been granted on green lending to support infrastructure development in Sri Lanka, though that is like a very handful of number of commercial banks that they have received this opportunity. So with such intervention by the government or the private public other partnerships, further we can stop the starve of green infrastructure development with more innovative and sustainable models. Also, in creating such sustainable models, I think what matters is having finance sector incorporating biodiversity and its opportunities into their core business by spreading accessible knowledge and having regular conversations with the environmental sector so that everybody could be on the same page, speaking on the same language, incorporating biodiversity into their business thinking. There should be some more involvement, but this is what I feel, more collaborations, as everybody spoke on this collaboration on the private-public sector when it comes to such assessment and measurements. It's true that we see these carbon credit schemes, biodiversity credit accrual system, which CDB is also currently working out with BSL, and the biocurrency approaches are coming in by bringing out the regulators, policymakers, trade associations, these banks and financial institutions and other business sectors. I think we will be able to not only to turn sustainable finance policies into action, but also we could strengthen the measurement to capture market impact, because it's all about collaboration. So with the time constraint, let me give my final thoughts. So I would like to say that we all need now during this post-COVID is a transformative actions with redefined business purposes and adapt a resource mobilization strategy and adapt a strategy to provide financial flows for biological diversity and mitigate climate risk. So there is a huge potential exists for both the financial sector and conservationists to work together, promoting sustainable finance and thereby to amplify the efforts to protect the Sri Lanka's biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aroshi. And in fact, to maybe echo the need for collaboration, there was a recent study by Oxford University on corporate biodiversity, and the disclosures amongst the top 100 Fortune 500 companies identified that only 49 of the companies reviewed were disclosing action on biodiversity in their corporate sustainability reports, and only 6 of these, of the 49, mentioned either the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Aichi targets. So in contrast, of course, 24 mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and which suggests that unfortunately the Aichi targets have much less traction with the private sector than compared to other societal goals. So these are all elements we need to build on, and in order to frame to build a framework for corporate biodiversity, which, as you said, it's about collaboration. So with that, I want to, before we move to the sum up, I would like to share a couple of questions which we have from the participants. The first is to Dr. Markus Lehmann. Dr. Lehmann, the question is, when does the CBD expect governments to adopt the post-2020 GBF and embed it into legislation? Is that a timeline that is anticipated?
Well, in principle, I mean, once the post-2020 framework is adopted by COP15, I guess there is a general expectation that parties, but certainly not just parties, but also other stakeholders and major groups move to implementation as soon as possible. Now, the specifics of that, that's I think it's not yet clear. That will be up for further negotiations and agreement by parties. You will recall that for the current framework, when the current framework was adopted in Japan in 2010, they in the associated COP decision, there was an invitation to parties to revise and update their NBSUPs in line with the strategic plan, and parties did that, but that process actually took more time than initially expected. So there is actually quite a number of parties which have basically their NBSUP just recently adopted, fresh off the press, so to say. And of course, I mean, to go to another full-fledged revision and updating procedure would, for those parties in particularly, be rather cumbersome. And given that we know that it's also taking a lot of political energy, which will be then missing for actual implementation activities, it might be even counterproductive. So these are all facets of the discussion which is currently taking place and which will basically shape the precise mechanics of what is foreseen in terms of implementation and the timeline that you mentioned. There seems to be widespread agreement that the NBSUP as a tool will remain the main tool for implementation, but then how to specifically translate the post-2020 framework onto the existing policy framework at national level, that will remain to be seen, what specific guidance the global community can give there. And then, of course, I mean, important consideration is to give the adequate discretion to the national level, to basically the stakeholders, the players at national level, so that they can adapt this implementation machinery to the own national circumstances.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lehmann. We have another question. We have actually two more questions, but the next one to Padma Adekon, Director of the Biodiversity Secretariat. Padma, the question is, how realistic is the achievement of the NBSUP targets by 2022, given the gap in required finances?
Yeah. For the discussion, we did the assessment to prepare 6 national report in 2018. At that time, we realized many stakeholders were attending to implementation of the NBSUP. But your question is valid, because of the financial constraints, many activities within the targets will remain for the future. Therefore, we need to review the NBSUP and identify the activities what we can include to the post-2020 global framework. And we need to identify smart targets, measurable, achievable, and like that, with the financial resources. Now, some extent we are implementing with the national and the global financial resources. We have received some JEF funding as a grant, and some loans also received World Bank like that. Then we implemented, but some activities and some targets will remain for the future as well. Your question is valid.
Thank you, Padma. Appreciated. The final question is to Dr. Roshan Rajadure. Roshan, it is, have you done any impact assessment against your investments?
Well, to answer that question, to our knowledge, there are no global or international metrics or KPIs to assess, do an impact assessment. But I can confidently say that there are other proxies by which we can measure, or we can sort of manifest or demonstrate the impact of all these biodiversity initiatives we have done. For example, in the plantation areas, like we have reduced deforestation, man-made fires, and increase the rate of reforestation. In terms of water, like we have seen a steady decline in waterborne diseases and improvement to quality of life where water is related. Soil erosion, there are many myriad numbers of initiatives, but unfortunately we don't have matrix, we don't have quantitative figures or any matrix to indicate that there is an impact assessment has been done. But as I mentioned earlier, the proxies are there to show that there has been an impact, and those are recorded in terms of the improvement to the overall quality of health of the community. We can see that definitely compared to a few years back, the species numbers have increased, hunting has reduced, because we have an inventory every 5 years where we can see that increase of indigenous plants being preserved. Even when we introduce any tree crop, we have sort of very conscious that we are introducing indigenous plants. So the awareness process has gone through, and people are more conscious of the need for biodiversity in terms of protecting it and sustaining it than it was before. So I'm afraid I cannot tell that there is an assessment being done, but I can confidently say that the impact has been felt and it's been sustained through other proxy measures related to biodiversity initiatives.
Thank you, Roshan. Much appreciated. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Markus Lehmann to share some comments, and we will then move to a wrap up from Mrs. Shirani Yasaratna. Markus.
Yes, thank you very much. And I was requested to stay brief, given that we are already well over time. So to just say, it was extremely interesting for me, because working at the global level with the number of parties that are involved in the CBD, it is sometimes difficult to stay abreast of the national dynamic and the national situations, and as biodiversity and business engagement unfolds at the national level. So from that perspective, it was fascinating for me to see the various initiatives and work on the ground in Sri Lanka. So I'm thankful for that, and for having been part of that discussion today. I think it's good to see that businesses in Sri Lanka, and of course the Sri Lanka business platform, is actively looking already at the post-2020 framework and what can be done to implement it, and what can be done to strengthen biodiversity policies at the national level. Of course, working closely together with the government of Sri Lanka, and hopefully also with other key stakeholders, non-governmental organizations, civil society, etc. So thanks again. That was a pleasure. I would have loved to be with you in person, but of course, as we were reminded, I mean, one important advantage of these virtual meetings is the efficiency aspect of it, and it would have been very unclear that I would have the resources and time to basically travel around the globe to be with you. So I'm very pleased that at least virtually I could join you today. Thanks again for having me, and my best wishes to the companies that spoke, but also in particular to the Sri Lanka business platform, our old friend Hashini, you Dilhan, for your excellent work, and my best wishes for your future work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Lehmann. However, we must make sure that we take you up on that option of a face-to-face meeting, because the taste of a good cup of tea or a good Sri Lankan curry, it can't be transmitted virtually. So we look forward to the pleasure of welcoming you soon, and of course the same to you, Gerard. But meanwhile, I would like to invite Mrs. Shirani Yasaratna to share her wrap-up.
Thank you, Dilhan. I think we had an extremely interesting, very rich discussion, and especially for us being in Sri Lanka, to reach the global scene where biodiversity is concerned, it gives us a lot of room for thinking and look at how to move forward in this agenda. So thank you to Markus and Gerard for bringing those perspectives in. Looking at the Sri Lankan context, Mrs. Abekon told us that our Sri Lankan National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan was devised in 2016. Now, at that time, I'm not sure who really, whether the government brought private sector into the discussion, but our platform was maybe not really involved in that discussion. But in the future, and of course in the present context, we are really looking forward to being more and more involved. Now we have an 85 member strong network, and I think that's a great alliance for the ministry to work with. And in fact, the ministry is involved. We have an MOU with the government on assisting the CBD implementation. And basically what we would like to say in wrap up is that whatever the government does with respect to the CBD and taking the national agenda forward, our businesses are very much interested to be connected. And we often have said that the voice of business is not heard in the dialogues of this nature. Most of them are not aware, and we also found out from them that they are not aware of the IT targets. They know more about the Sustainable Development Goals than even our NBSAP and the targets that are to be achieved, whilst they are doing so much to contribute towards those targets. So all we say is for the government to recognize what the private sector is doing and bring them into the national agenda, into their reports, national reports, and give them due credit for the work that is being done. Now we at the platform are running an online survey where we are looking at the projects that the companies are doing in Sri Lanka with respect to biodiversity and trying to align them with the NBSAP targets so that the ministry can then see where the investments are going and perhaps drive them in the right direction to working towards the national agenda. So what I would like to say to the government and also to our businesses is to try to work in line with the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which Mrs. Abekon said would be translated into the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, so that we can then all work together to bridge this gap that we have in finances. And very soon we will know through our survey how much investments our companies are putting in into the national biodiversity targets. So we are very committed. The sectors that were represented by our membership also showed their true commitment to the effort that is being done by government. So cooperation is key, and that is the message I would like to give everybody so that we can all move forward in unison. So that's my wrap up, Dilhan. It's over to you.
Thank you, Shirani. So the outcome of this discussion will be a draft paper which will be forwarded to the government, and it will essentially also represent ways in which Sri Lankan businesses can mainstream biodiversity into their corporate processes more effectively. And in conclusion, aligning private sector, the government, and academia in arriving at this objective that we have now seen underlined so conclusively by COVID, and accepting that things cannot revert to the former version of normal post-COVID. I believe that this represents our best way forward. For us as Biodiversity Sri Lanka, as Dilmah Conservation, we and our members, we are very committed to building that alignment and to delivering tangible and effective outcomes. So with that, I would like to thank UNDP, thank our speakers. Thank you very much, Markus. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Padma. Thank you, Ramita, Nalaka, Aroshi, Roshan. Thank you, Shirani. And have a good evening, or in some cases, have a good morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilhan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.